That seems to have settled. So, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining today's session. Nice to see some familiar names and faces. My name's Jonathan, and I'll be guiding you through this webinar. A quick word about Siren. We specialize in first aid, fire marshal, mental health, all accredited courses that help organizations build a healthier and more inclusive environment. One of our key offerings is sexual harassment prevention training. We provide an accredited CPD session, or actually CPD sessions, plural, available both in person and virtually. And we also offer e-learning options if your organization needs to train larger groups more efficiently. Before we begin, a few housekeeping options. So if you can please keep your microphones muted during the sessions. We'll have a Q&A at the end. Feel free to submit any of your questions using the chat box at any time. After the webinar, you'll receive a short feedback form. We really do value your thoughts as they really help us improve what we offer. And you also get a little gift from us in the feedback form. If you find today's session helpful, if you could leave us a review, that would also be appreciated. But no more of me waffling on. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Jenna Randall. Jenna brings a wealth of expertise in workplace culture and gender equality. She holds several degrees in gender and inequalities and has worked both in-house and as a consultant. Her focus is on helping organizations drive equitable cultural change through effective systems, processes, and coaching. So, Jenna, handing over to you.
Thank you so much, John, and lovely to see everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining from. As John mentioned, I'm Jenna Randall. I won't go over my background again, but just to say, lovely to meet you all. Thanks for joining, and I hope you get a lot out of today's session. I am running these sessions quite frequently, so I have a lot I want to share with you today. So we're going to go ahead and get started, if that's all right. Today, what we'll do is speak about the legal duty and what that means for organizations in the UK. We'll speak specifically about the training element of that, although it's not just about the training, and what training should cover to be compliant. I'll run you through what we're seeing when we deliver, what organizations find really useful with respect to the training, and then we'll have time for a Q&A. I know some of you have already sent questions through, which is great, and hopefully we'll get to address most of them. So I hope that sounds okay. So first, before we do anything else, we're going to talk about why sexual harassment matters right now. Most of you probably already know the Worker Protection Act came into force about a year ago, and that put a proactive responsibility on employers to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And we know that there's a couple of reasons why we know it's important, particularly now, because even though sexual harassment was already illegal in UK workplace legislation, it's a significant business risk. We know that in the UK, the average payout for sexual harassment is around 53K, and that doesn't include legal costs or any sort of reputational damage. It's important because, and as I'm seeing as I train businesses, a lot of employees don't understand exactly what it is. So it's not clear, right? So the legal duty says the organizations need to make sure employees are clear on what sexual harassment is and what it isn't. And unfortunately, sexual harassment is still way too prevalent in general, but particularly in the workplace. So depending on what sector you come from, I don't know if there's anyone in aid or international development, but one DevX article recently cited that up to 86% of humanitarian workers knew a colleague who had experienced harassment. If you work in the legal sector, polls and surveys from that sector had said that bullying and harassment towards junior barristers is about 44% of those surveyed, right? So, we're seeing it in multiple sectors and manifests in different ways. In manufacturing and engineering, when we asked the trade bodies of that sector, 69% of women said they had experienced sexual harassment. And when we asked hospitality and leisure, we saw 67% of women had experienced sexual harassment. Now, I'll say that, of course, sexual harassment is illegal no matter who is on the receiving end of that harassment, right? So a lot of the surveys cite women because unfortunately it is more prevalent and it happens more often to women than men, but the law makes it illegal for anybody, any gender. So it is important specifically for those reasons, but if you look just at the organizational risk, you can see that there's a host of reasons why you might want to consider this. So in addition to the cost that I mentioned, I think it was $53K for an average payout if this happens to you. Where organizations are seeing this happen, the wider impacts of sexual harassment in the workplace include things like lower productivity for staff, lower innovation, lower levels of creativity. The ripple effects of that, of course, is toxic workplace cultures, lower staff morale, et cetera. So, there are significant business risks and organizations are starting to tackle this. I think one of the most famous cases recently was McDonald's, and they haven't cited publicly what the financial implications were, but it has been estimated that all of their costs together has between 6 million and 140 million just to tackle, the large cases they've had. And of course, it's not just about organizations. The consequences of sexual harassment for an individual can be quite dire. So even if someone removes themselves from a situation of sexual harassment, the damage done can have long-term knock-on effects for quite a while. We have seen, unfortunately, things like psychological and mental and emotional distress. So things like feelings of shame, humiliation, feeling undermined at work, cases of anxiety and depression, sleep issues. I mean, the list is unfortunately quite long. And this actually manifests and impacts self-esteem, confidence levels, and of course, a person's career trajectory and career progression, right? Someone may need to take off more sick days if they are experiencing harassment in the workplace. And that will have longer term impacts as well, such as derailing a career. So it is quite a grave topic. There are different levels of severity, but the law now is about preventing it. So we don't see any of these impacts. So we are going to launch a poll now. It should say, how confident are you that your organization is doing enough to meet the legal requirements? You should see it pop up on your screen. Great, so you've got lots of options here about the renewal of policies. Great. Okay, right, so they're starting to trickle in. Great, thank you all for participating. Almost all of you have answered, so I'm going to end the poll in a couple seconds. Okay, it's quite interesting. All right, I'm going to end the poll now. So you should be able to see what's come through. So people are saying that they've done things from policies to some e-learnings to some risk assessments. We've had quite a varied response, which is great, because what you'll see is that there's no one right thing to do for an organization. The law does give you some guidance, which we'll speak about in a minute, but this is what you've said that overall you're doing as a sector, I'd say. So let's talk about what you need to do to be compliant. there is no one overall body checking what each employer has or hasn't done. And most likely, the only time you will be asked to demonstrate compliance is if your organization is involved in a tribunal. Hopefully, it doesn't get to that. But that is why there are no hard and fast rules, and that actually can be slightly worrying because it's not easy necessarily to know what to do. So employers are liable if it happens in the workplace unless they can show that they took all reasonable steps to prevent it, right? That is wording taken from the new duty. You have to take all reasonable steps. And the shift in compliance actually is the new duties from being reactive now to being more proactive, right? Taking those reasonable steps to prevent it. So what does that look like? Some basic compliance, or what you'll see organizations doing, and probably what some of you are doing, and are doing things like updating your policies, adding the new correct and exact definition of sexual harassment as per the Equality Act. You'll be explaining reporting lines in your policy. You'll be speaking in those policies in your communications about the consequences of being a perpetrator of sexual harassment. You'll be doing some basic training, maybe some e-learnings, ensuring colleagues are aware of what sexual harassment is. You'll be doing messaging, clear messaging on zero tolerance at your organization. And then, of course, last but not least, and this is really important, are those risk assessments. Risk assessments are a part of that sort of basic level of compliance. Organizations should be able to demonstrate that you've thought what can be the risks to your specific organization and your specific workers, and then what you've done to prevent that, right? So because every organization is different, every risk assessment will look different. And if you want to break that down into what that risk assessment is, it looks like, it can be as basic or as complex as you'd like. In the session that we run, in the manager section, we help managers do that. But in a nutshell, it's essentially pinpointing the risks, considering what are the reasonable things you could do, including your budget, the resources you have, right? And then taking those steps. More advanced approaches. So if you are leaning towards best practice, is this something that you've been working on for a while? I've been seeing organizations doing things like having more interactive training with role-based scenarios, particularly for when you're training your managers, right? So those in-person live sessions, which of course can help you with. Doing things like asking staff where they might feel at risk. Doing staff surveys to ask about the culture. Do employees feel that they can speak up? Do they trust the reporting process, right? That is vital information that organizations can gather, that data. Leadership is fundamental in culture change. Making sure leaders are on board, they understand the policies, and they are role modeling their commitment to anti-harassment. Role modeling speaking up, responding with compassion when people do bring up concerns around harassment. And of course, if you are able to collect that data, being able to pinpoint the hotspots and the risks, and keeping track of the different incidents, you can perhaps see any trends in where staff do feel more vulnerable, looking for patterns of unwanted behavior. And also data on what are the lessons learned when we unfortunately have these experiences happened in our workplace, right? So there are a lot of things you can do. I mean, I've seen also organizations co-design policies with their employee forums and their networks. And you don't necessarily need, one of the questions that came through in advance was asking about what to do if you've got limited resource or limited HR resource and limited financial resource. You don't necessarily have to have anything complex, but anything that you have done, like a risk assessment wise, should be documented, right? So, if you've got limited resource, sure, do the messaging, do some e-learning, but particularly for your managers, invest in that interactive training so that you can be compliant with the new law. So we're going to dip into a piece that we would have on the session. Our training, this is, I'm going to go through like what our session will include, but first, what should good training include? And I think it doesn't have to be overcomplicated, but we want a training that builds awareness around what sexual harassment is and what it isn't. We want a training that explores those gray areas, right? Because this isn't a topic that's black and white. There's no silver bullet. And that's why it's important to be able to equip your employees, particularly your managers, to respond to these types of situations and to prevent these situations. So our training covers the legal definition and the case study and some case studies. And these case studies will be tailored to your sector, but it's important to have employees understand what real tribunals could look like, right? So we do offer that, but then we do some fictional case studies. And that's what we're going to do today together. The session also includes the impacts of sexual harassment, which we've spoken about previously, the roots of sexual harassment, right? Understanding that it's not just an isolated phenomenon. We look at banter. We talk about the risk factors in your particular workplace. And then there's a speak up session, which is challenging inappropriate behaviors, right? So teaching colleagues a skill to go away with. If they recognize something that's inappropriate, what can they do about it? So it's the awareness piece and it's a skill piece in the training, which is CPT accredited. So let's look at a hypothetical scenario. I'm going to read it aloud for people who may be on their lunch break and preparing their lunch. Is this sexual harassment? So Stan is an engineer for a utility company. Part of his job involves visiting customers' homes to carry out routine checks and maintenance. On one visit, the customer, a woman in her 30s, makes repeated comments about his appearance, saying things like, "Wow, they send the good-looking ones out here," or "You must break a lot of hearts doing this job." She laughs as she says this, but then moves closer while Stan is working and touches his arm lightly. Stan feels uncomfortable but doesn't know what to say without being rude. He finishes the job quickly, avoids eye contact, and gets out of there. Later, he mentions this to a colleague who just laughs and replies, "Oh, that's nothing. Customers flirt all the time. It's just part of the job. Laugh it off." All right, so I'd love people to show me by a show of hands if they think this. Well, if you think it's sexual harassment, give me a thumbs up emoji. If you're unsure, give me a thumbs down, or if you think it's not, give me a thumbs down. Okay, right, yeah. So I haven't actually given you the definition yet, so you're not expected to know. Maybe you do know the definition. We're going to speak about that in a minute. Great, okay. So even in workplaces that are respectful, there can be misunderstandings and harm can occur if we don't have this clear understanding of what it actually is. So this is taken from the UK Equality Act. Sexual harassment is unwanted conduct of a sexual nature that violates a person's dignity or creates an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. And that comes directly, as I mentioned, from the UK Equality Act. Now, it's important to note that in order to be classified as sexual harassment, it has to meet this definition. But I'm going to pull out a few things for you, a few key things for you here. The first thing is it's an unwanted behavior. Okay? And behavior can be anything and everything from verbal to nonverbal to body language, and it is a behavior. And it's important to highlight that even if people think they're being nice or they're providing someone a compliment, or when they think something is done out of goodwill, a gesture, a behavior, but still it can technically be sexual harassment if the behavior is unwanted. Okay, so this is where a lot of people start asking about, okay, well, I didn't mean to offend. Even if you did offend, it still can be sexual harassment if it meets the definition. So that's important to highlight. Secondly, of a sexual nature is important to highlight because there's no one clear definition of what is meant by sexual according to the law. So of course there are things that are more obvious than not, right? But there's definitely gray area and differing definitions. It wouldn't necessarily be obvious to some people, but if it can be in some way, shape, or form thought of as sexually explicit or of a sexual nature, then it could stand up in court, right? So I would always err on the side of caution because of this wide variety of definitions that we have. Even if something that was intended as a joke, given a particular context, it could be sexual harassment. So that brings me to the third aspect, which is the context and the environment. Right? Environment is important because any sort of comment, banter, behavior doesn't have to be intended for a third party for it to be considered sexual harassment. So, for example, I don't know that Mark and Adrian are dating. And if Mark tells Adrian, hey, you look sexy very frequently, right? I may interpret this as sexual harassment. I don't necessarily know their relationship, right? They're not directing their behavior at me. It's just between them. But if it's in the workplace, if it's an environment where other people are around, that would stand up in court. So employees are able to complain about behavior that they find offensive, even if it's not directed at them. Screensavers, phone wallpapers, calendars, pictures, if it's in the workplace, it's impacting the environment. So a man, for example, may feel harassed by having to listen to colleagues make, sexist jokes or jokes of a sexual nature, even if he's not part of that banter. And that's something that we speak about very much in the session, and we deconstruct those gray areas and help people learn feeling more comfortable in the gray areas. So, and there's a case from a while back that showed male employees were viewing pornographic images in the workplace, even though they weren't sharing it with this other female employee. She brought it to an employment tribunal and was awarded compensation because it was it fit the definition of sexual harassment. Even though the images were not sent directly to her, they were in the workplace environment. So what are some other behaviors? Right, because this is about behaviors, which in some sense is great because we can change behaviors. We can't necessarily maybe change a lot about people, but people can change their behaviors. So we've got things like inappropriate messages, a lot that we're doing online these days. Sexual harassment can creep into messaging and WhatsApp and Teams platforms and Slack, right? It's not just about verbal harassment, it can be written. It can be comments about bodies or appearance, right? Remember back when I shared the definition, I said, okay, I may be intending to give John a compliment about the way he looks, but still it could make him uncomfortable. So it could technically be sexual harassment, right? So but it's not about, and what tends to put people at ease is the understanding that it's not necessarily, it doesn't mean you can't be nice to people anymore. It doesn't mean that you can't have office banter, but you've just got to be really careful around the things of a sexual nature. So John, I'm going to ask you if at this point there's anything in the chat, because I haven't been able to monitor. Are there any questions about the definition or anything I've said so far? We will have time in a couple minutes. But yeah, just if there's anything I can address now.
Brilliant. Yep, apologies in advance if you're getting the side eye. My screen's on this end. But question from the chat is, would it be considered a good business decision to put out an anonymous survey to find out from staff if they have experienced or feel comfortable on how to report harassment? The results might be able to help back up risk assessments with data from a source.
Yes, The short answer is yes to that. I think you want to have multiple reporting channels, and one of those can be anonymous. Of course, you can only do limited things with an anonymous report, but it does help you track trends for sure.
Brilliant. And sticking on that theme, Jenna, of risk assessments, how frequently should they be done?
I think it really depends on the environment that you're in, but that's a really good point that you have to be able to update your approach semi-regularly. So, I mean, organizations are doing it at least once a year, kind of like an updated, for example, fire risk assessment, right? It's you don't do the policy once, update the policy and it's done. You don't do the risk assessment once and it's done. You need to be continually updating that risk assessment. And really, if your business circumstances are changing frequently, you probably need to risk assess more frequently. So if you bring on like there's a merger and acquisition and you bring on a whole cohort of employees, well, that's a good time to do it. But if you have a fairly stagnant, and I don't know which organization doesn't really do change, at least I'd say that at least once a year. But
Great. No,
yeah,
that's great to hear because that's really consistent with my speciality, fire risk assessments, which is if you have any major changes to the premises, you do need to carry out a new fire risk assessment or at least a review. And then the final one, perhaps before we move on, Jenna, when will it become a compulsory assessment here in the UK, if it's not already?
so the legal aspect of it, and I am not a lawyer, but it's not necessarily compulsory in the sense that nobody is checking, right? But if you have a case of sexual harassment and it's taken to tribunal and you don't have that risk assessment, that's when you're in trouble. So it's kind of like it is compulsory, but there's no overseeing body for doing that, right? But of course, like this can be part of your health and safety approach. It can be part of your well-being approach. It can be part of your D&I approach. So there's many different spaces where you should be tackling this, and compulsory according to the law can be gray. So I would it's highly encouraged to do it.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think a similar term we use with fire, Jenna, is best practice. Is best practice kind of thing. But yeah, if we can move on and we'll take any more questions at the end.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah. So we've seen the definition, and this is also something that we do in the session. All right, we've gone back to the same case study of Stan, this customer-facing engineer, and we use case studies because they make the law real. They bring it to life, and we're able to encourage reflection and discussion around any gray areas. So in a situation like this, where we've got Stan, we discuss the banter line. For example, like what is the banter line? What does your organization tend to be okay with, and where is the gray area, right? And that always gets a lot of pushback in session. There's always quite a lively discussion because everyone is different and all organizational culture is different, but it still needs to be clear what is appropriate and what is inappropriate in the workplace. So with this case study, for example, this banter from the customer would be inappropriate. So in essence, Stan's employer needs to make sure that he is shielded from or does preventative work so that he's not facing this type of harassment, because this is sexual harassment, what we're seeing on this screen. We'd also talk about impact versus intent. I've mentioned that it doesn't matter what the intention is. Maybe she's trying to flirt. Maybe she's just trying to be nice. We don't know. We don't know the scenario, but it doesn't matter. Stan is uncomfortable, and that's all that matters. And we can say that it fits the definition. We'd also discuss power dynamics. And that's a big one in a lot of workplaces. And that can mean the power dynamic between two colleagues, for example, someone who's in a more senior role versus someone who's in a more junior role, someone who's managing someone else. But we also discuss the power dynamics of customers and clients with employees. There, in some sense, is the idea that the customer is always right. And if we want to win back business from clients, right, that also creates a power dynamic. And when you do your risk assessments in the workplace, you'll see that where there are power dynamics, those are the higher risk areas. So Stan being sent to a customer's house can potentially be high risk. And then we also would discuss other work factors like lone working, the type of workplace culture you have, and accountability, right? So often when people work alone or they're in one-to-one scenarios, there can be people can get lax on that accountability. Well, no one's around, so no one's going to hear this discussion I'm having. So, in this case with Stan, and there's no one around, just Stan and the customer. Sometimes people's inhibitions get lowered, right? So this would be a typical case study that we'd use for someone in this sector. And in the session, we look at multiple case studies in terms of the different types of situations employees can find themselves in. And then at the end of the session, we would talk about more case studies to help people to learn to speak up. Right? It's not just about recognizing what sexual harassment is, it's what do we do about it. So the other things that are really important to address in a training like this, and of course it is tailored to your organization, is your organization's policies and procedures. I mentioned earlier that this is something that and you answered in the poll, a lot of organizations are updating their policies. That's great. But also, are your staff aware of it? Do they know how to access it? Is it clear? I mean, those are things that we are supporting organizations with, just to update their policies. And in this training session, we will show it just to make sure. Again, there's always a good opportunity to show your colleagues your policies and your procedures, reporting procedures, for example. Another thing we like to do is, as I mentioned, talk about banter. This is an optional activity, but as I mentioned, it's something that we find that colleagues really like to discuss, and it helps people understand where those personal boundaries can differ, right? Because everyone's an individual and it has different background and experience and has a different banter line. But this discussion really brings to life that aspect of, personal boundaries and what we're responsible for doing in the workplace. Can the workplace have banter? Absolutely. If it's banter about things of a sexual nature, is that okay to have? No, right? So while there is gray area around sexual harassment, there still is a clear line. And that's what we're helping organizations to do, is have their employees understand where is exactly that line within the gray area. It's also sometimes talking about if you have an international colleague base, or if you work internationally, what your employer obligations are. People travel, or if you have people from different countries come and work in the UK. And we speak about where the gray areas could be there and what to do. And finally, for all sessions that involve managers, we do speak about manager responsibilities. And this is something that managers can get involved in at any level. If you're managing people at any level, being able to take that preventative risk lens and forward plan. And so there are activities in this session that help managers start to learn to do that. And we highly recommend, for that reason, a very interactive sort of live session on that. So just before we finish, for example, I'm going to hand back to Johnny because I know people may have questions. In this particular situation, managers could do things like role model allyship. Manager could do things like ensuring that they speak to Stan and his colleagues about reporting procedures in advance. Learning to be compassionate if someone speaks up about this. I mean, you might have seen this case study and giggled about it because, how likely is it that that would happen? Well, it does happen. We've seen from statistics, right? So in the manager section, these are the types of things we talk about from a manager perspective. So yes, we do have a couple questions, and I will hand back to John to address those.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you, Jenna, and thank you everyone who attended. I know there was a few technical difficulties for those that arrived a bit later. Just to let you know, we will be sending out a recording of this so you can view it in full. And if you had any colleagues that had technical difficulties, you'll be able to share on that link. I mean, thanks for your time, really. I do hope you found it valuable. We will be sending out a feedback survey after the webinar. Please do fill it in because it's really helpful for us. It will contain a discount or a gift, shall I say, should you want to book one of our CPD accredited courses. And then lastly, if you get time, do fill in one of the reviews. What I will also mention is we've perhaps only got about 8 minutes or so. So if we don't get to your question now, feel free to put something in the feedback form or pop us an email. We'd love to start a dialogue with you. Now, I'm going to move on to one of the pre-submitted questions. This question is, we are an LGBTQ plus nightlife venue, so there are a lot of interactions and drunk customers. Would be great to hear of guidance within this context.
Yeah, so thank you for submitting that question. And I think night venues and any environment containing alcohol, for example, like workplace socials, it's always going to be higher risk. So if there are, I mean, of course, you'd have to do a risk assessment for your individual organization because every organization is different. But there are certain things that you can do. So things like creating zero tolerance messaging. This may be something that you already do with respect to health and safety, but some things that I've seen that work in this sector are visible tolerance messaging. So things like putting up posters and signs around the venue saying, this is our policy, you'll be chucked out if you don't comply. Printing it on, in the back of bathroom doors or putting it on menus, for example. I know there's a great Ask for Angela campaign also that some organizations take part in. So things like that, making it very clear to patrons what's acceptable and what's not. You can also do that circulation of messaging before events, put it on people's tickets if they buy it on Eventbrite, for example. We do not, we expect that all patrons comply with our sexual harassment policies. Here they are, provide a link, right? And then I've seen even some organizations do things like just, if they're not nightlife venues, for example, but if alcohol and parties is a high risk for them, they don't allow it at workplace functions. That's a quite radical approach, and everyone will do what they think is appropriate. But this organization that I'm speaking about decided that they had too many inappropriate incidents in the past directly related to alcohol, so they just cut out the alcohol. Somewhere in between, you've got, making sure that staff are aware of the policy, being explicit about the fact that if staff misbehave at the workplace parties, what the consequences will be. So there is a lot around, what you can do with that messaging. You can also, once you've identified your hotspot risks, you can do anything and everything from rotating staff, people who perhaps maybe are newer or more junior, making sure that they're not in those hotspot risks or wherever those, high traffic areas are where you think they may be experiencing harassment from the public. You could implement a buddy system, right? So there are lots of things you can do to tackle the hotspots. And then of course, staff training, right? Sexual harassment training, prevention, of course, but also staff who are interacting with the public, maybe de-escalation training, maybe bystander intervention training, maybe training people on how to assert their boundaries politely, right? So all that can be done for your staff. And these are really good practical steps for for those types of environment. And I would say just finally on that one, empowering your employees, creating a culture where employees feel like it's okay to speak up, give them permission to assert the boundaries and give them permission to speak up. And I think, not to complicate it more, but yeah, there are multiple things you can do, but those are just a couple of things that I've seen organizations do previously.
Thanks, Jenna. That's great. I mean, I really appreciated the idea of rotating hotspots. Just from experience, I've worked in entertainment venues where there might be certain bars that no one wants to work in because they're busier, and it was down to the discretion of the manager who's doing the rotas. So it's really nice to hear that rotation side of things. Moving on to the next question, um, which is, what steps should we take to make sure that all employees feel safe reporting any sexual harassment incidents?
Yes, it's a really important part of the puzzle, really, because you can have the greatest policy in the world, but your organization can still be risky if the culture doesn't feel safe for employees to speak up or report. So I think in terms of best practice for reporting, I'd say have clear reporting lines in your policy. Make it clear where employees can go if they need to report something. Normally that's to HR, that's to their line manager, or to any company director or whoever the most senior person is. Often, because of the power dynamics I've named previously, it can be the direct line manager that is the perpetrator. So employees need to have other options than just their line manager to report. Hold training for managers on what to do when an incident happens so they know how to respond appropriately. Make sure that managers are role modeling that behavior of being able to speak up, because if employees don't see their managers doing it, they won't speak up. They'll say, well, what's the point, right? And then I'd say finally on the reporting question, make sure you have multiple reporting lines. And I think that was someone's question earlier about, can we do anonymous surveys? Yes, absolutely. That's a good place to start. And in fact, it's always going to be useful to have one anonymous reporting line, but also try and encourage employees to actually report, right, in face to face, because that may be difficult, but if you're doing that culture work around us making sure people feel okay to speak up, the culture work around role modeling good practice around speaking up, then your employees should feel hopefully safe enough to make those reports, because you can do a lot more with real data than you can with anonymous data, but have those multiple reporting lines for sure.
Brilliant, Jenna. And I'm going to take perhaps one last question, but before I do, I'm appreciating all the comments that we're getting in the chat, and I just wanted to kind of highlight that whilst we do kind of have different levels of CPD accredited training, if you are looking for a live in-person session, similar to how we've done this webinar today, we do normally have a quick 20-minute catch up with myself, Jenna, or with Jenna and one of my colleagues in the sales team. So we will try and bespoke it to either your organization or tailor it to the sector that you're in, whether it's nightlife, whether it's construction. Jenna, I'm just going back now to what you mentioned about reporting, because I felt this question might link in a bit. If you had a concern raised, how could you prove if you don't have any witnesses? Kind of, is there a level of burden of proof that's needed for?
So I mean, again, I think that probably depends, but what's important to distill when you're trying to create that culture where reporting is safe is that people will not be victimized because of reporting, right? Neither the person who's been named nor the person who raises the grievance, and that is actually part of equality law, that it's illegal to do that victimization piece as well, right? So let's say that I make a report and I'm reporting John for your terrible behavior. Maybe there has or there hasn't been evidence. No matter what the outcome of that situation is, neither John nor myself should be victimized in the sense that we can't be sidelined or not given work opportunities anymore just because we have been implicated in or initiated an investigation, either formal or informal. So I think, without knowing the context, the answer to that is it really depends. But I think what's important to remember when you're thinking about this is, do you have the culture that allows people to speak up? And are you giving your colleagues permission to, speak up, and then and they know that they won't be victimized as a result?
Brilliant. Well, we're going to bring it to an end because we appreciate that everyone's time's valuable. But as I mentioned, if you want to book in a call with us, feel free to on the feedback form. Do fill in that feedback form because it helps me explain to my boss why we need to do these. And thank you so much. Just going to end with a few shout outs. Nice to see some familiar faces, as I've mentioned. Thanks for joining, Jack. Thanks, Eric. Nice to see you again. And just looking at any other names that I recognize, but most importantly, thank you to everyone. Bye for now.